Chapter 24. Fun fact, this is the second time I'm recording this because there was a really loud puppy that wouldn't stop crying. So I was recording for 10 minutes and then it was just so loud and it was so irritating, so I had to find it and make it stop. I didn't hurt it, I just freed it from its prison. So now it's playing and it's not loud anymore, but now I have to start all over again. So, chapter 24. Meanwhile, the Count had reached his new residence in the Avenue de Champs-Élysées. Two men came out to meet his carriage when it drew up before the door. One was Ali, who smiled at his master with an incredible outburst of joy and who felt himself amply repaid by a look from Monte Cristo. The other bowed humbly and presented his arm to help the Count alight from his carriage. "Thank you, Monsieur Bertuccio," said the Count. "Is the notary here?" "He is in the small salon, Excellency." The Count passed into the small salon led by Bertuccio, who showed him the way. The notary was waiting for him. "Are you the notary empowered to sell the country house I wish to buy?" asked Monte Cristo. "Yes, sir." "Have you brought the deed of sale?" "Here it is, sir." "Now where is this house I'm buying?" asked Monte Cristo nonchalantly. The notary looked at him in astonishment and said, "Do you mean to say, sir, that you haven't even seen it?" "How the devil could I have seen it? I arrived in Paris for the first time in my life only this morning. In fact, this is the first time I've ever set foot in France." "I understand, sir. The house you're buying is situated in Auteuil." Auteuil. At these words, Bertuccio paled visibly. "And where is Auteuil?" asked the Count. "It's only a short distance from here, sir," replied the notary. "It's a little beyond Passy, in a charming location in the middle of the Bois de Boulogne." "So near, but that's not in the country. Why have you chosen me a house at the gates of Paris, Monsieur Bertuccio?" "But, Excellency," cried Bertuccio, "I had nothing to do with choosing that house. Please be so kind as to think back, to remember—" "Ah, yes, now I remember," said the Count. "I read an advertisement in the newspaper and let myself be misled by the lying title, Country House." "There's still time, Excellency," said Bertuccio eagerly. "If you wish me to search elsewhere, I'll find a house in a better location." "No, never mind," said the Count indifferently. "Since I have this one, I might as well keep it." "And you're quite right, sir," said the notary earnestly. "It's a charming residence." "Very well then," said the Count. "Hand me the contract." He signed rapidly, then said, "Bertuccio, give this gentleman 55,000 francs." The steward walked out of the room and returned with a stack of banknotes, which the notary carefully counted. "Are there any other formalities?" asked the Count. "No, sir." The Count nodded in a way which said clearly, "I don't need you any longer. You may go." The notary bowed deeply and withdrew. "Monsieur Bertuccio," said the Count, "didn't you once tell me you'd traveled in France?" "In certain parts of France, yes, Excellency." "Then you no doubt know the suburbs of Paris." "No, Excellency, no," replied the steward with a sort of shudder which the Count, a keen judge of emotions, rightly attributed to deep anxiety. "That's unfortunate," said the Count, "because I want to go to see my new house this evening, and you could have given me some useful information on the way to Auteuil." "To Auteuil?" cried Bertuccio, whose copper-colored complexion became almost livid. "Do you want me to go to Auteuil? What's so astonishing about that? You're a member of my household, aren't you?" Bertuccio bowed his head before the Count's imperious gaze and stood motionless without answering. "What's the matter with you?" said Monte Cristo. "Are you going to make me ring twice for my carriage?" Bertuccio rushed into the antechamber and cried out in a hoarse voice, "His Excellency's carriage." The Count sat down and wrote 2 or 3 letters. As he was sealing the last one, his steward reappeared and said, "The carriage is at the door, Excellency." "Very well, take your hat and gloves." "Am I going with you, sir?" "Of course. I intend to live in that house, so I'll have to give you my orders." Bertuccio followed his master without any further objection, but Monte Cristo noticed that he crossed himself as he walked out of the house and that he mumbled a prayer when he had taken his seat in the carriage. 20 minutes later, they were in Auteuil. "We shall stop at 28 Rue de la Fontaine," said Monte Cristo, looking steadfastly at Bertuccio. Beads of sweat broke out on Bertuccio's forehead, but he obeyed the Count's order. He leaned out the window of the carriage and called to the coachman, "Stop at 28 Rue de la Fontaine." Oh my gosh, we heard about this address before. This address was mentioned before, guys. No, it's so cool. If you remember, doesn't that address sound familiar? 28 Rue de la Fontaine. That came up in the story before. Try to remember where we heard that from before. Night had fallen during the trip, or rather, a black cloud charged with electricity had given a solemn and dramatic appearance to the premature shadows. The carriage stopped, and the footman leapt down to open the door. Monte Cristo and Bertuccio alighted. "Knock on the door and announce me," said the Count. Bertuccio knocked, the door opened, and the porter appeared. "This is your new master," said the footman, handing the porter the notary's order. "The house has been sold, then?" asked the porter. "Yes," replied Monte Cristo, "and I'll try to see to it that you have no cause to regret losing your former master." "Oh, I won't miss him much, sir, because we almost never saw him. He hasn't come here in over 5 years." "What was the name of your former master?" "The Marquis of Saint Méran." Okay, we also heard that name before. The Marquis of Saint Méran is a name that we heard before. "That name sounds familiar to me," said the Count. "Let's see now, the Marquis of Saint Méran." He appeared to be searching his memory. "An old gentleman," continued the porter, "a loyal supporter of the Bourbons. He had a daughter who married Monsieur de Villefort, who was public prosecutor at Nimes and then at Versailles." All right, the Marquis of Saint Méran was the father of the woman who married Villefort. Sorry, that's my phone. I have to put it on silent mode. Okay. So the Marquis of Saint Méran was the father of the woman who married Villefort, and Villefort is one of the reasons why Dantes went to prison. One of the villains who needs to be punished. Monte Cristo glanced at Bertuccio and saw that he was as white as the wall against which he was leaning to keep from falling. "And didn't that daughter die?" asked the Count. "It seems to me I heard that somewhere." "Yes, sir. She died 21 years ago, and since that time the poor Marquis hasn't been back here more than 3 times. "Thank you," said the Count, accompanying his words with a gift of 2 gold coins, which brought forth an explosion of blessings and sighs. "Take one of the lanterns from the carriage and show me around the house, Bertuccio," said the Count. Bertuccio obeyed without objection, but the trembling of his hand showed how much it cost him to do so. After inspecting the first floor, they went up to the second. In one of the bedrooms there, the Count noticed the entrance of a spiral staircase. "Here's a private staircase," he said. "Light my way, Monsieur Bertuccio, and we'll see where it leads to." "It leads to the garden, sir," said Bertuccio. "How do you know that, may I ask?" "I mean, it probably leads there, sir." "Well then, let's find out for sure." Bertuccio heaved a sigh and led the way. The staircase did, in fact, lead to the garden. When he came to the outside door, Bertuccio stopped, panic-stricken and almost fainting. "Well?" said the Count. "No, no," cried Bertuccio. "No, sir, I can't go any further. It's impossible." "What do you mean?" asked the Count coldly. "It's not natural, sir. Of all the suburbs of Paris, you bought a house in Auteuil, and of all the houses in Auteuil, you bought the one at 28 Rue de la Fontaine, as if there were no other house in Auteuil except the one in which the murder was committed." So, the Count servant Bertuccio, no, he obviously knows something, and he's freaking out because the Count bought this house, which belonged to the wife of Villefort, who died. The wife died, no, of Villefort, and now Bertuccio is saying that a murder happened in this house. "You're a true Corsican, Bertuccio, always mysteries and superstitions. Come, take your lantern and let's have a look at the garden." Bertuccio picked up the lantern and obeyed. The Count stopped before a clump of trees. Bertuccio could contain himself no longer. "Get away, sir, I beg you," he cried. "You're standing right on the same spot." "What spot?" "The spot where he fell." I'm afraid you've gone mad, Monsieur Bertuccio, said the Count. Try to pull yourself together and explain to me what you're talking about. I've told you about it only once in my life, replied Bertuccio, and that was to be the Abbé Busini. Such things should be told only under the seal of confession. In that case, Monsieur Bertuccio, I'll be forced to send you back to your confessor. I don't like members of my household to be afraid to go into my garden at night. Also, I admit that I wouldn't be at all happy to receive a visit from the police on your account. I knew you were once a smuggler, but I didn't know you had other strings to your bow. You are no longer in my service, Monsieur Bertuccio. Oh, Excellency, cried the steward, if it's a question of remaining at your service, I'll tell you of everything. That's different then, said Monte Cristo, but if you're about to lie, reconsider. It would be better for you not to speak at all. No, sir, I swear by the salvation of my eternal soul that I'll tell you everything. Where shall I begin? Wherever you like, since I know nothing of your story. But I thought the Abbé Busini told you. Yes, he told me a few details, but that was 7 or 8 years ago, and I've forgotten almost everything he said. Well then, it all begins in 8... Okay, so now Bertuccio, the servant of the Count of Monte Cristo, is telling us the secret of this house, that the Count of Monte Cristo bought. He knows something about this house, and it has to do with a murder, and now we are going to find out what's going on. Well then, it all begins in 1815, but I can remember it all as clearly as though it were yesterday. I had a brother, an older brother, who was in the service of the Emperor. He was a lieutenant in a regiment composed entirely of Corsicans. That brother was my only friend. We became orphans when I was 5 and he was 18, and he raised me as though I were his son. He was married in 1814 under the Bourbons. When Napoleon came back from the Isle of Elba, my brother rejoined his army. One day we received a letter from him. I forgot to tell you we were living in the little village of Rogliano in Corsica. The letter told us the army had been disbanded and that he was returning by way of Châteauroux, Clermont-Ferrand, Le Puy, and Nimes. He asked me to send some money to Nimes, where he would pick it up from a certain hotel keeper with whom I had dealings. Did your dealings with him involve smuggling? Asked Monte Cristo. A man has to make a living, sir. Yes, of course. Go on. I loved my brother deeply, as I've already told you, Excellency, so I decided to take him the money myself, instead of sending it to him. I had 1,000 francs. I left half of it with my sister-in-law Assunta and set out for Nimes with the other half. Now it was just the time when the famous massacres were taking place in the south of France. Organized bands of assassins were killing everyone suspected of being a Bonapartist. I was almost wading in blood when I entered Nimes. There were corpses everywhere and the assassins were killing, pillaging, and burning. When I saw that, I shuddered, not for myself. I was a simple Corsican fisherman and had nothing to fear, but my brother was still wearing the uniform on one of the emperor's soldiers and therefore had everything to fear. I ran to see our hotel keeper. My fears had been justified. My brother had arrived at Nimes the night before and had been killed at the very door of the hotel. I did everything I could to find out who his murderers were, but they were so dreaded that no one dared to tell me their names. Then I went to see the public prosecutor, whose name was Villefort. He was from Marseille and had only recently been promoted. They say he was one of the first to report Napoleon's return from Elba. My brother was murdered yesterday, I told him. I don't know who did it, but it's your duty to find out. Who was your brother? Asked Villefort. A lieutenant in a Corsican regiment. A soldier in the army of the usurper, then? A soldier in the French army. Every revolution has its catastrophe, said Villefort, and your brother was a victim of this one, which is unfortunate. But if we had to prosecute every case of vengeance taken against the partisans of the king by the partisans of the usurper while they were in power, your brother would perhaps have been sentenced to death. What's happening now is only natural. It's the law of reprisals. What? I said. How can you talk like that? You, a magistrate? You Corsicans are all mad, said Villefort. You think your compatriot is still emperor. You should have come here 2 months ago. It's a little late now. Leave my office, and if you won't leave, I'll have you thrown out. All right, I said to him. Since you know Corsicans so well, you must know how they keep their word. You think my brother deserved to be killed because you're a royalist and he was a Bonapartist? I'm a Bonapartist too, and I have only one thing to say to you. I'm going to kill you. So Bertuccio is also an enemy of Villafort. Jerk good si Villafort, guys, no? From this moment, I declare a vendetta against you. The next time we meet, it will mean that your last hour has come. Then before he could recover from his surprise, I opened the door and ran out. What? Said Monte Cristo. With your honest face, Monsieur Bertuccio, you did such a thing to a public prosecutor? Did he at least know the meaning of the word vendetta? He knew it so well that from then on he never went out alone, and he had the police look everywhere for me. Fortunately, I was so well hidden that they never found me. Then he became afraid to stay in Nimes any longer. He asked permission to change his residence, and since he was a man with influence, he was named public prosecutor at Versailles. But as you know, there's no such thing as distance for a Corsican who was sworn to avenge himself on his enemy, and I was never more than half an hour behind his carriage all the way to Versailles. The important thing was not simply to kill him. I'd had dozens of chances to do that, but to kill him without being discovered or arrested. My life no longer belonged to me, for I had my sister-in-law to protect and provide for. I watched Villafort constantly for 3 months. Finally, I discovered that he made mysterious trips to Authier, to this very house. But instead of coming in through the front door, he would leave his horse or his carriage at the inn and enter through the little door you see here. I left Versailles and moved to Authier, for it seemed to me I'd have a better chance of catching him there. I found out that the house belonged to the Marquis of Saint-Méran, as the porter has already told you, Excellency, and that the Marquis was Villafort's father-in-law. Since the Marquis lived in Marseille, the house was useless to him, and he had just rented it to a young widow who was known only as the Baroness. One night, as I was looking over the wall, I saw a beautiful young woman walking in the garden. I saw immediately that she was pregnant, and that her pregnancy was rather far advanced. A few moments later, the little door opened and a man entered. The young woman rushed to meet him. They threw themselves in each other's arms, embraced tenderly, and went into the house together. The man was Monsieur de Villefort. I realized that when he came out, he would probably cross the whole garden alone. And did you ever learn the woman's name? Asked the Count. No, Excellency, replied Bertuccio. As you'll see, I didn't have time to learn it. Go on. So Bertuccio wanted to kill Villafort good, and he found this house, and he found there a mysterious pregnant woman. There was a mysterious woman there who Villafort seemed to be with, and she was pregnant, and she was very, very pregnant, and again, Bertuccio wants to kill Villafort, and so he's spying on him, and that's how he kind of found out about this secret woman of Villafort. I might have been able to kill him that night, but I wasn't familiar with the garden, and I was afraid that might prevent me from escaping if he should have time to cry out for help. 3 days later, at about 7 o'clock at night, I saw a servant leave the house and gallop away on horseback. He came back 3 hours later, covered with dust. His message had been delivered. 10 minutes after that, another man opened the door of the garden and went in. I hadn't seen Villafort's face, but I recognized him by the pounding of my heart. I took out my knife and climbed over the wall. I hid in the clump of trees nearest to where I believed Villafort would pass on his way out. So guys, it's not an accident, no? Bertuccio, this was the man that the Count saved, okay? The Count saved him, from being executed. And the fact that he knows something about Villafort and that he is an enemy of Villafort, and the fact that the Count of Monte Cristo just bought this house, it's not coincidental, good. The Count of Monte Cristo obviously has an intricate and a complicated plan, and again, this whole novel, good, it's really one of revenge, good. And so we're kind of putting the puzzle pieces together, but it's very clear that the Count of Monte Cristo has a plan, good, because none of it is by accident. He got close to Albert for a reason. He saved Bertuccio for a reason. He bought this house for a reason. There is a reason for everything that he is doing. Two hours later, the door opened and Villefort came out. As he came toward me, I saw that he was carrying what at first I thought was a weapon of some kind. But then I saw it was only a spade. A spade is like a shovel. He stopped outside the clump of trees where I was hidden, and began to dig in the ground. It was only then that I noticed he was carrying something under his coat, which he had taken off to give himself more freedom of movement. My hatred became mixed with curiosity, and I decided to wait and see what Villefort was doing. After a while, I saw him take out a box about 2 feet long and 8 inches wide from underneath his coat, put this box into the hole he had dug, and cover it over with earth. Then I rushed at him, sank my knife into his chest, and said, "I'm Giovanni Bertuccio, your death for my brother and your treasure for his wife. My vengeance is more complete than I expected." I don't know if he heard these words. I don't think he did, because he fell without uttering a sound. I dug up the box, took it out, and ran out of the garden through the little door in the wall. Okay, so, oh my gosh, this is so intense. See, Bertuccio was watching Villefort. Villefort buried a box. He buried a very small box, and Bertuccio watched him, and after he was finished burying it, Bertuccio ran out and stabbed Villefort, and then he dug up the box and took it with him, Was there a handsome sum in the box? Asked Monte Cristo. It wasn't money, Excellency. I ran as far as the river, sat down on the bank, and opened the box. Inside it, I saw a newborn baby whose purple face showed that it must have been smothered to death. Then it seemed to me I felt a slight heartbeat. I began to breathe air into its lungs, and after a quarter of an hour, I heard it utter a cry. I uttered a cry also, but a cry of joy. God hasn't cursed me, I said to myself, because he's allowed me to give life to one human being in exchange for the life I took away from another. So Bertuccio stabbed Villefort, grabbed this box, and inside the box was a baby that seemed to be smothered to death. They tried to kill this baby, but Bertuccio was able to bring it back to life. He was able to make it breathe again. Oh my gosh. This is the most intense chapter ever. The fine swaddling clothes in which the child was wrapped showed that its parents were wealthy. I took the precaution of cutting them in half so that one of the 2 letters with which they were marked was on the half I took and the other was on the remaining half. Then I left the child in front of an orphanage, rang the doorbell, and ran away as fast as I could. 2 weeks later, I was back in Rogliano, and I said to Assunta, "Console yourself, my sister. Israel is dead, but I've avenged his death." Then I told her everything that had happened. "Giovanni," said Assunta, "you should have brought back the child. We'd have taken the place of the parents he's lost, and we'd have called him Benedetto in honor of the blessing God bestowed on us." My only answer was to give her the half of the swaddling clothes I had kept in order to claim the child if we should someday become richer. "What were the letters on the swaddling clothes?" asked Monte Cristo. "An H and an N surmounted by a baron's crown." Okay, so the baby was wrapped up in a blanket and it had 2 letters on it, an H and an N. He cut this blanket in half. Half of the letters he sent to the orphanage with the baby, the other half he kept. "I'm curious to learn 2 things, said the Count. "What are they, Excellency?" "What became of the little boy? You did say it was a little boy, didn't you, Monsieur Bertuccio?" "No, Excellency, I don't think I did, but in any case, it was a little boy. What was the other thing you wished to know?" "I'd like to know what crime you were accused of when you asked for a confessor, and the Abbé Bossini came to see you for that reason in the prison at Nimes." "It's a rather long story, Excellency. That doesn't matter, it's only 10 o'clock as you know. I sleep very little, and I don't suppose you feel much like sleeping right now. Bertuccio bowed and resumed his story. Partly in order to drive away the memories that haunted me, and partly in order to provide for my poor brother's widow, I went back to the trade of smuggling with greater energy than ever before. Since my brother had been murdered in the streets of Nimes, I refused to go back to that town. The result of this was that the innkeeper with whom we had formerly carried on our smuggling affairs, seeing that we were no longer coming to him, came to us and opened another inn called the Pont du Gard Inn, on the road between Bellegarde and Bucar. We had a dozen or so places like that where we could deposit our merchandise and where we could hide from the customs agents and the police if necessary. One day, as I was about to leave on a smuggling expedition, Assunta said to me, "I'll have a surprise for you when you come back." I questioned her about it, but she would tell me nothing. When I came back 6 weeks later, the first thing I saw was a cradle with a baby in it. Assunta had gone to Paris during my absence and claimed the child. Ah, Excellency, I confess that when I saw that helpless little creature sleeping in its cradle, my chest swelled and tears came to my eyes. "You're a good woman, Assunta, and Providence will bless you," I said. Alas, though, that child was the very means God had chosen to punish me. A more perverse character was never manifested at an earlier age, and yet no one can say it was because of his upbringing, for my sister-in-law treated him like the son of a prince. By the time he was 11, his closest friends were a group of young men between 18 and 20 years old, who had already been in a number of escapades which deserved a more serious name, and about whom the police gave us several warnings. Hold on. Okay. I was about to leave on an important expedition. Assunta always defended Benedetto in our discussion of him, but she admitted that several times she had noticed the disappearance of rather large sums of money, so I told her of a place where she could safely hide our little treasure. Then I left for France. We were to land our cargo in the Gulf of Lions. It was in 1829, and smuggling operations were becoming more and more difficult. Order had been completely established by then, and the coasts were therefore patrolled more carefully than ever. Our operations went off smoothly in the beginning. We tied up our ship, which had a double bottom in which we hid our smuggled goods, among all the other ships that lined both banks of the Rhone. From there, we began to unload our cargo and pass it into the city by means of certain people who were in contact with us. Either because our success has made us careless or because we were betrayed, one night as we were about to sit down to supper, our cabin boy came running in to tell us that a squad of customs police were headed in our direction. We leaped to our feet, but it was already too late. Our ship was surrounded. I went down into the hold, slid out through a port, and swam underwater. And man, Bertuccio's story is so intense. Until I reached a small canal that connects the Rhone with a canal that runs from Bucar to Aigues-Mortes. Once I arrived there, I was safe, for I could follow the canal without being seen. It wasn't by accident that I chose this route. I believe I've already told you, Excellency, about an innkeeper from Nimes who had opened an inn on the road between Bellegarde and Bucar. What was his name? Asked the Count, who was apparently beginning to take a certain interest in Bertuccio's story. His name was Gaspard Caderousse, Excellency. He was a husky man of about 40 who had more than once proved his courage and presence of mind in difficult situations. Again, another connection. No, Bertuccio would hide in an inn, and this inn belonged to Caderousse. Okay, another person who was responsible for Dantes' betrayal. Alright, so, man, this book is so smart. Everything is so well connected. "You say this was in 1829, said the Count. "What month was it?" "June, the 3rd of June. "I see. June 3rd, 1829, said the Count. "Go on." "As I said, I decided to take refuge in Caderousse's inn. Even under ordinary circumstances, we didn't go in through his front door, so I certainly didn't do it this time, for he might have had some travelers staying at his inn. I slipped through the garden hedge and was soon in a sort of loft in which I had more than once spent the night when I had no better bed. This loft was separated from the main room of the inn only by a wooden partition in which peepholes had been made to enable us to watch for the opportune moment to make our presence known. Just as I slipped into the loft this time, I saw Kadaru come in with a stranger. I kept quiet and waited. The man with Kadaru was one of those traveling merchants who come to sell jewelry at the Beaucaire fair. The priest didn't deceive us, said Kadaru to his wife. The diamond is genuine, and this gentleman, one of the most important jewelers of Paris, is ready to give us 50,000 francs for it. But in order to be sure the diamond really belongs to us, he'd like you to tell him, as I've already done, the miraculous way it fell into our hands. In the meantime, sir, sit down, and I'll bring you something to cool you off. Tell me about it, madame, said the jeweler, no doubt anxious to take advantage of Kadaru's absence to see if his wife's story would be the same in all details. Well, said Madame Kadaru, it was a completely unexpected blessing from heaven. 14 years ago, my husband knew a sailor named Edmond Dantes who went to prison. In prison, he met a rich Englishman who gave him a diamond when he was set free. Dantes wasn't so lucky, for he died in prison. Just before he died, he left us the diamond and told the priest who came this morning to deliver it to us. That's the same story your husband told me, said the jeweler, and I suppose it may very well be true. Unlikely, though, it seems at first. Now, all we have to do is to agree on the price. What, said Kadaru? I thought we'd already agreed on the price I asked for. I offered you 40,000, said the jeweler. 40,000, cried Madame Kadaru. We certainly won't let it go for that price. The priest told us it was worth 50,000. I'll go as high as 45,000, but not another sou, said the jeweler. All right then, said Kadaru, we'll sell it to someone else. As you like, my friend, said the jeweler, but I brought the money with me, as you can see. He took out a roll of banknotes and a handful of gold, which sparkled before Kadaru's eyes. Kadaru was torn by indecision. He turned to his wife and whispered, What do you think? Give him the diamond, she replied. If he goes back to Bukhar without it, he'll denounce us, and we'll never be able to find the Abbe Busoni again to support our story. So be it then, said Kadaru to the jeweler. Take the diamond for 45,000 francs. The jeweler counted out 15,000 francs in gold and 30,000 francs in banknotes. Wait a minute, I'll light a lamp, said Madame Kadaru. It's getting dark in here, and we might make a mistake. Night had fallen during their discussion, and with it came the storm which had been threatening to burst for half an hour, although none of the three of them seemed to have taken notice of it. Would you like to stay for supper? Asked Kadaru. Thank you, answered the jeweler, but I must get back to Bukhar. My wife will be worried. Just then there was a clap of thunder, and a flash of lightning lit up the room. Are you going to leave in weather like that? Asked Kadaru. Oh, I'm not afraid of thunder. And what about robbers? The road is never safe during the fair. As for robbers, said the jeweler, these are for them, and he pulled out 2 loaded pistols. All right then, bon voyage, said Kadaru. Thank you, said the jeweler. He took his cane and opened the door to go out. As he did so, there was a terrific gust of wind which almost blew out the lamp. And to think that I have to walk 2 leagues in weather like that, said the jeweler. Stay, said Kadaru. You can sleep here tonight. Yes, stay, said his wife in a trembling voice. We'll take good care of you. Oh my gosh, Bertuccio he's such a sneak. Like, he witnessed so many things. You know, like at first he witnessed Villafort's burying a dead baby. And then now he's witnessing Kadaru selling this diamond, and them kind of inviting the jeweler to just spend the night in the inn. No, I must get back to Beaucaire tonight. Goodbye. Why did you invite him to sleep here tonight? Asked Madame Kadaru when the jeweler had gone. Why, so he wouldn't have to go back to Beaucaire tonight, said Kadaru, starting. Oh, said the wife, I thought it was for something else. Why do you have such ideas? Cried Kadaru. And if you have them, why don't you keep them to yourself? Listen, you've offended God. As he said these words, there was a tremendous clap of thunder and a bluish flash of lightning. Then the thunder died slowly away, as though regretful at having to leave the accursed house. Madame Kadaru crossed herself. At the same time, in the midst of that terrified silence which usually follows a clap of thunder, they heard someone knock on the door. They both started and looked at each other in alarm. "Who is it?" cried Kadaru, putting his hands over the money lying on the table. "It's Monsieur Joannes, the jeweler." "You see," said Madame Kadaru, "you said I'd offended God, but God has just sent him back to us." Kadaru turned pale and sank into his chair, but she walked decisively over to the door, opened it, and said, "Come in, Monsieur Joannes." "It looks as if the devil doesn't want me to go back to Beaucaire tonight," said the jeweler, who was soaked to the skin. "You've offered me your hospitality, Monsieur Kadaru, and I've come back to sleep here tonight." Kadaru mumbled a few words and wiped away the sweat that was streaming down his forehead. His wife locked the door behind the jeweler. "Are there any other guests staying in your inn tonight?" asked Monsieur Joannes. "No." "I'm not inconveniencing you?" "Inconveniencing us? Not at all, Monsieur Joannes," said Madame Kadaru graciously. Kadaru looked at his wife in surprise. While the jeweler stood warming himself before the fire, she laid out the leftovers from their dinner, to which she added 2 or 3 fresh eggs. "There," she said, putting a bottle of wine on the table. "You can eat supper whenever you're ready." The jeweler sat down to supper, and Madame Kadaru served him with all the care of an attentive hostess. When he had finished, she said to him, "You must be tired. I've put clean sheets on the bed. Go upstairs now and sleep well." The jeweler stayed for another quarter of an hour to see if the storm might die down. Then, seeing that it was growing even worse, he said good night to his host and hostess and went upstairs to bed. Madame Kadaru looked after him eagerly, but Kadaru turned his back to him. I recall all these details later, but they made little impressions on me as I watched them taking place. Aside from the story of the diamond, which struck me as somewhat unlikely, it all seemed perfectly natural. Since I was extremely tired, I decided to sleep for a few hours and then leave in the middle of the night. I was sound asleep when I was awakened by a pistol shot, followed by a terrible shriek. Then I heard groans and stifled cries as though some sort of struggle were taking place. One particularly loud cry, which faded away to a groan, roused me from my lethargy completely. Everything was quiet now. Then I heard a man's footsteps coming down the stairs. He entered the downstairs room, walked over to the fireplace, and lit a candle. It was Kadaru. His face was pale, and his shirt was covered with blood. He went upstairs again with a lighted candle and came back down a moment later with the diamond in his hand. He rolled it up in his red handkerchief, which he tied around his neck. Then he went over to the cupboard, took out the banknotes and the gold, rushed out the door, and disappeared into the darkness. So Kadaru killed the jeweler. No, the one they sold the jewel to. He killed him and took the jewel back. Everything became clear to me then, and I reproached myself as though it were I who was guilty. I seemed to hear a groan. Perhaps the poor jeweler was still alive. I pressed my shoulder against one of the planks that separated my loft from the rest of the house. It gave way. I picked up the candle and began to run up the stairs, but I found them blocked by a body. It was the corpse of Madame Kadaru. Oh my gosh. Madame Kadaru died. The pistol shot I heard had been aimed at her. I stepped over her body and went into the bedroom. It was in terrible disorder. The unfortunate jeweler was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, which flowed from 3 large wounds in his chest. In a 4th wound was a kitchen knife with only its handle showing. I tripped over the second pistol, which was not cocked. Its powder had probably gotten wet. I went over to the jeweler. He was not yet dead. At the sound of my footsteps, he opened his eyes and moved his lips as though trying to speak, then died. Oh my gosh, the jeweler was like, This chapter, so long but so intense. The horrible scene had almost made me lose my reason. Now that I could no longer be of help to anyone, I had only one desire, to flee. I ran down the stairs, holding my head in my hands and roaring in terror. Downstairs, there were 5 or 6 customs agents and 2 or 3 gendarmes. They seized me. I was in such a state of shock that I didn't even try to resist. I tried to speak, but I could only utter inarticulate cries. Then I realized they took me for the murderer. I pulled away from the 2 men who were holding me and began to shout, "I didn't do it! I didn't do it!" 2 gendarmes pointed their carbines at me and said, "If you make one movement, you're dead. You can tell your little story to the judge in Nimes." They handcuffed me, attached me to the tail of a horse, and took me to Nimes. I had been followed by a customs agent who had lost me in the vicinity of the inn. Suspecting that I would spend the night in there, he had gone back for reinforcements. They had arrived just in time to hear the pistol shot and arrest me in the middle of such evidence of guilt that I realized immediately how hard it would be for me to now prove my innocence. My only hope was to ask the judge to order a search for a certain Abbe Bossini. If Kadaru had invented a story, if that priest did not exist, I was clearly lost, unless Kadaru himself were caught and confessed everything. 2 months went by, during which, I must say it to my judge's credit, every effort was made to find the priest. Then on the 8th of September, 5 days before the date set for my trial, the Abbe Bossini came to my prison and said he had heard that a prisoner there wanted to speak to him. You can easily understand how overjoyed I was to see him. I told him everything I had witnessed in the inn, and contrary to my expectations, he supported Kadaru's story about the diamond. It was then that, impressed by his understanding, charity, and hoping that he might pardon me for the only crime I had ever committed, I told him under the seal of confession all the details of the adventure at Ati. My spontaneous confession of the first murder, which nothing forced me to reveal, convinced him that I had not committed the second one. He promised to do everything he could to persuade my judges that I was innocent. I had proof of his efforts when my trial was postponed to the following session of court. In the meantime, Kadaru was arrested in a foreign country and brought back to France. He admitted everything, but attributed the premeditation and instigation to his wife. He was sentenced to hard labor for life, and I was set free. Was it then that you came to me with a letter from the Abbe Bossini? Asked Monte Cristo. Yes, Excellency. He seemed to take considerable interest in me. Smuggling will be your downfall, he told me. Abandon it if you get out of prison. But how can I make a living and provide for my poor sister-in-law? I asked. One of my penitents, who has great respect for me, has asked me to find him a trustworthy steward. If you like, I'll recommend you to him, but I want you to swear I'll never have any cause to regret it. I raised my hand to swear, but he said, it won't be necessary. I know Corsicans and I like them. Here's my letter of recommendation, and he wrote me the letter I gave to you. Excellency, now let me ask you with pride, Excellency, have you ever had reason to complain of me? No, replied the Count. I admit with pleasure that you are a loyal servant, Monsieur Bertuccio, although you lack confidence in me. I, Excellency? Yes, you. Why is it that you have a sister-in-law and an adopted son, and yet you've never said a word to me about either of them? Alas, Excellency, I still haven't told you the saddest part of my life. I went back to Corsica, but when I arrived in Rogliano, I found the house in mourning. There had been a horrible scene which my neighbors still remember vividly. My poor sister-in-law, following my instructions, had refused the demands of Benedetto, who wanted her to give him all the money in the house. One morning, he threatened her and disappeared for the rest of the day. Assunta wept, for she had a true mother's heart for the wretched boy. He came back at 11 o'clock that night with 2 of his friends. They seized her, and one of them, I tremble at the thought that it may have been Benedetto himself, said, "Let's torture her, then she'll tell us where the money is." So this baby that Bertuccio saved, and that his sister adopted, turned out to be this huge jerk who, with his friends, wanted to rob the mother that adopted him, and they wanted to torture her until she would give them all of her money. My neighbor Wasilio was in Bastia at the time. His wife was in the house alone. She was the only one who saw and heard what was happening in my sister-in-law's house. 2 of the young men held Assunta while the other one locked the doors and windows. Then, smothering her shrieks of terror, they began to hold her feet over the fire to make her tell them where her treasure was hidden. But her clothes caught fire in the struggle. Bertuccio, what? This chapter 24, is the most intense thing in my entire life. Her clothes caught fire in the struggle, and they let go of her in order not to be burned themselves. She was found the next morning, half burned but still breathing. The cupboard had been broken open, and the money was gone. As for Benedetto, he left Rogliano and never came back. I haven't seen or heard of him since then. It was after learning this tragic news that I came to you, Excellency. I didn't mention either Benedetto or Assunta to you because Benedetto had disappeared and Assunta was dead. The Abbe Busoni did well to send you to me, said Monte Cristo, and you did well to tell me your story, for I'll have no more bad thoughts about you. And now to end this discussion of your adventures, which will be our last, remember these words, which I have often heard spoken by the Abbe Busoni himself. For every evil there are two remedies, time and silence. The Count, after taking one last walk around the garden, went back to his carriage. Bertuccio, seeing how pensive he was, silently climbed up and sat down beside the coachman. The carriage set out for Paris. That was the most intense chapter ever. Chapter 24, man!